The story that has been told to the world for over a century is deceptively simple. While excavating the ancient workshop of the royal sculptor Thutmose in Tel El Amarna, Borchards' team unearthed a limestone bust of extraordinary beauty. The face that emerged from the sand was that of Queen Nefertiti, the legendary wife of Pharaoh Akhenaten, whose name means the beautiful one has come. But as we shall see, this tale of archaeological triumph may be nothing more than an elaborate deception, one that has profound implications for how we understand the systematic erasure of African identity in our museums and collective memory. Suddenly, we had in our hands the most alive Egyptian artwork. You cannot describe it with words. You must see it. Yet even in this moment of supposed triumph, something was amiss. The bust lay face down in the sand, almost perfectly intact, a miraculous preservation that should have raised immediate suspicions. In the very same room, another bust had been found shattered into 1,000 pieces. Yet this one had somehow survived 3 millennia without so much as a significant crack. How convenient. How impossibly convenient. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. There was no official excavation report documenting this earth-shattering discovery. None. For an archaeological find of such magnitude, this absence is not just unusual, it's virtually unprecedented. The published report of 1913 on the excavations of Thutmose's workshop made no mention whatsoever of the bust. The first scientific reports on the discovery weren't written for 11 years after the alleged find. 11 years. Imagine discovering the Mona Lisa and then waiting over a decade to tell anyone about it. The silence is deafening, and it speaks volumes about what may have really transpired in that workshop in Amarna. The plot thickens when we examine what happened during those mysterious early days after the discovery. According to Swiss art historian Henri Stierlin, whose groundbreaking book, Le Buste de Nefertiti, sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, the truth is far more sinister than anyone imagined. Stierlin's research reveals that Borchards' team had been experimenting with ancient pigments, trying to understand the manufacturing techniques of Akhenaten's craftsmen. They had abundant access to the minerals necessary for creating pigments, and limestone was readily available at the site. In other words, they had both the materials and the knowledge to create a convincing fake. But the real twist in this tale comes with the visit of Prince Johann Georg of Saxony to the excavation site. When the prince saw the bust, he was immediately captivated by its beauty. And here, according to Stierlin, Borchardt faced a moment of truth that would change history. Rather than admit that the bust was a modern creation used for testing ancient techniques, this single moment of cowardice, or perhaps calculated deception, may have launched one of the greatest archaeological frauds in history. The prince's admiration gave the bust an instant pedigree, and the momentum of that royal endorsement carried it forward into the realm of accepted historical fact. For those who understand the spiritual and cultural significance of ancient Egyptian art, one detail about the Nefertiti bust should have immediately raised red flags: the missing left eye. In Kemet, as ancient Egypt was known to its inhabitants, the eyes were considered the windows to the soul. They were sacred, powerful, and essential to the spiritual integrity of any representation of a person, especially royalty. To depict a beloved queen, and Nefertiti was indeed beloved by her people, with one eye missing would have been considered an act of profound disrespect. According to most specialists, this is the first evidence that the piece is fake. This is not a minor detail or an artistic choice. In ancient Egyptian belief systems, the missing eye would have been seen as a curse upon the queen, a deliberate mutilation of her spiritual essence. No royal sculptor would have dared create such a piece, and no pharaoh would have allowed it to exist. The missing eye is not evidence of ancient craftsmanship. It's evidence of modern ignorance about Egyptian spiritual practices. Yet this glaring cultural impossibility has been overlooked or explained away by Western Egyptologists for over a century. Why? Perhaps because acknowledging it would force them to confront the uncomfortable possibility that one of their most prized possessions is nothing more than an elaborate fake. But the missing eye is just the beginning of the problems with this bust. Perhaps even more troubling is how the facial features have been crafted to conform not to ancient Egyptian beauty standards, but to early 20th century European ideals of feminine beauty. This observation cuts to the heart of a much larger issue: the systematic whitewashing of African history and identity. The features are refined according to Western standards, the skin tone ambiguous enough to allow European audiences to project their own ideals of beauty onto this African queen. The timing is crucial here. The bust was discovered in 1912 and first publicly displayed in 1924, right at the height of European colonialism in Africa, and during a period when scientific racism was being used to justify the subjugation of African peoples. A beautiful African queen who looked unmistakably African would have been problematic for the colonial narrative, but a Nefertiti who could pass for European, that was much more palatable. The scientific evidence, or lack thereof, provides another damning piece of the puzzle. While the pigments used on the bust have been tested and confirmed to be ancient Egyptian in origin, the limestone core has never been properly dated. This is a crucial distinction that most people miss. As Stearlin points out, the pigments could have been sourced from legitimate archaeological finds and then applied to a newly carved bust to give it the appearance of authenticity. The fact that the limestone core, the actual structure of the bust, has never been subjected to proper dating techniques is deeply suspicious. When pressed on this issue, museum officials often point to radiological tests that supposedly prove the bust's antiquity. But these tests, conducted by Berlin's Charité Hospital, only confirmed what was already known: that there is an inner limestone structure beneath the painted surface. They did not and could not determine when that limestone was carved. This is not an oversight. It's a deliberate avoidance of the one test that could definitively prove or disprove the bust's authenticity. Why would the world's leading museums and archaeological institutions avoid conducting the one test that could settle this controversy once and for all? The answer may be that they already know what that test would reveal. The story of the Nefertiti bust becomes even more disturbing when we examine its journey through the 20th century. It was finally displayed publicly in Berlin in 1924. The bust quickly became a sensation. But its most infamous admirer was Adolf Hitler himself, who called it a unique masterpiece, an ornament, a true treasure. The Nazi regime's fascination with the bust was not coincidental. It represented everything they wanted to believe about ancient civilizations: that true beauty and sophistication could only come from European or European-influenced sources. Ironically, Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, actually planned to return the bust to Egypt during the Nazi years. But Hitler refused, insisting that it would have pride of place in a museum for Germania, the expanded Berlin that was due to be the capital of his 1,000-year Reich. The symbolism here is profound and deeply troubling. A potentially fake representation of an African queen, whitewashed to conform to European beauty standards, became a prized possession of the Nazi regime. The same regime that was simultaneously promoting theories of racial superiority and committing genocide against those they deemed racially inferior. Perhaps the most damning evidence of all is the conspiracy of silence that has surrounded this bust for over a century. Despite mounting evidence of its questionable authenticity, despite the glaring cultural impossibilities, despite the suspicious circumstances of its discovery, the archaeological establishment has closed ranks to protect this artifact. Dietrich Wildung, the director of Berlin's Egyptian Museum, dismisses all questions about authenticity as attempts to exploit the bust's popularity, saying, "A beautiful woman and a putative scandal. That always sells. This dismissive attitude is typical of how the archaeological establishment responds to challenges to their authority, especially when those challenges come from scholars who dare to question the colonial narrative. The bust generates enormous revenue for German museums. 500,000 tourists visit it annually. It has become a symbol of German archaeological prowess and cultural sophistication. Admitting that it might be fake would not only be financially devastating, but would also force a reckoning with the colonial origins of many museum collections. It would force Western institutions to confront the uncomfortable truth about how they have systematically erased and appropriated African identity for over a century. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence against the bust's authenticity comes from an analysis of its artistic style. According to multiple experts, including those cited in the Daily Art magazine analysis, the bust is completely different from anything that has been created by the artists of that period. It does not match the standards of beauty of the Amarna period. It is more related to the beauty canons of the early 20s in Europe. This observation is devastating to claims of authenticity. Artistic styles don't exist in a vacuum. They reflect the cultural values, aesthetic preferences, and technical capabilities of their time. The Amarna period, during which Nefertiti lived, was characterized by a distinctive artistic style that emphasized naturalism and often exaggerated certain features for religious and political purposes. The Nefertiti bust, however, conforms perfectly to the beauty ideals of early 20th century Europe. The refined features, the elegant neck, the perfectly symmetrical face. These are not the aesthetic choices of an ancient Egyptian sculptor working in the service of a pharaoh who was revolutionizing art and religion. They are the choices of a modern artist working within the constraints of contemporary European taste. Even more tellingly, German Egyptologist Rolf Krauss has demonstrated that while the bust does follow certain proportional grids used by Amarna artisans, this could easily have been achieved by a skilled forger with access to archaeological knowledge about ancient Egyptian artistic techniques. The Nefertiti bust controversy is not just about one artifact. It's about the entire system of cultural appropriation and historical erasure that has characterized Western archaeology since its inception. If this bust is indeed a fake, it represents the ultimate irony. A modern European creation masquerading as ancient African art, housed in a German museum, and celebrated as one of the greatest treasures of human civilization. But even if the bust were authentic, its presence in Berlin represents a form of cultural theft that continues to this day. Egypt has repeatedly requested the return of the bust, and Germany has consistently refused. This is not just about one artifact. It's about the right of African peoples to control their own cultural heritage and historical narrative. The whitewashing of Nefertiti's features, whether intentional or not, has had profound consequences for how the world perceives ancient Egypt and African civilization more broadly. This matters because representation matters. When African children visit museums and see their ancestors depicted with European features, it sends a powerful message about whose beauty is valued and whose history is worth preserving. When scholars and the public accept without question that an African queen should look European, it perpetuates the same colonial mindset that justified centuries of exploitation and cultural destruction. As we reach the end of this investigation, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. The evidence against the Nefertiti bust's authenticity is overwhelming, from the suspicious circumstances of its discovery to the cultural impossibilities of its design, from the missing documentation to the convenient timing of its emergence. Henry Stierlin, Edrogan Ersivan, and other scholars who have dared to challenge the orthodox narrative have been dismissed and marginalized by an archaeological establishment that has too much invested in maintaining the status quo. But their questions remain unanswered, and their evidence remains unrefuted. The real tragedy is not that the bust might be fake. It's that the fake has become more famous and more influential than any authentic representation of this remarkable African queen. Nefertiti was a real person. a powerful ruler who helped transform ancient Egypt during one of its most fascinating periods. She deserves to be remembered and celebrated for who she truly was, not for how a German forger imagined she should look. The beautiful deception of the Nefertiti bust is ultimately a mirror that reflects our own biases, our own willingness to accept comfortable lies rather than confront difficult truths. It challenges us to ask harder questions about the artifacts in our museums, the stories we tell about the past, and the ways in which colonial attitudes continue to shape our understanding of African history and culture. Until we are willing to subject this bust to the rigorous scientific testing that could definitively prove or disprove its authenticity, until we are willing to confront the possibility that one of our most cherished artifacts might be nothing more than an elaborate fake, we remain complicit in the ongoing erasure of authentic African identity and history. The beautiful one may have come, as her name suggests, but the question remains: is the face we see truly hers? Or is it the face of our own prejudices and desires, carved in limestone and painted with the pigments of deception?